Welcome everyone to week 2 of COP26 and also week 2 of ClimaTalk's live streamed discussions. These are focusing on the developments and the disappointments from COP26, and today we're focusing on nature and ocean policy at COP this year. My name is Katrina and I am the COP26 events coordinator at ClimaTalk. ClimaTalk, for those of you who aren't aware, is a youth-led non-profit organisation that seeks to demystify climate policy and amplify young people's voices in the fight against the climate crisis. So as I said, today is the fourth, I believe, of our live streamed discussion sessions talking about COP26. And today we're focusing on nature, which was discussed last Saturday, and the ocean, which I don't believe had an entire day of negotiations or discussion on it, unfortunately, but it is, of course, nonetheless important. So it's our additional topic for today. To help me talk about those things, I'm very kindly joined by Emily Matthews, who is our nature tracker on COP26, and Vincent, who also very kindly joined us for our first live discussion on finance, who has been tracking oceans this time around. So to facilitate our discussions, both of our trackers have very kindly put together their 3 key takeaways on nature and the ocean, respectively, from COP26. These are quite informal chats. These are more about informing you on the updates from COP26 on these particular subjects. But nonetheless, we kind of have a broad structure whereby we envision spending the first 20 minutes of our discussions on nature and the latter 20 minutes on the ocean. So yeah, I think we will kick off with nature then, Emily, if that's okay, looking to you. I thought sort of the first question to sort of, I guess, give context to our audience and keep us all grounded in the same area would be to sort of ask you a bit about what do we mean by nature, because nature is surely about the broadest topic area one could imagine, particularly when talking about climate change. So what sort of areas were encapsulated by this topic? What sort of things were you expecting from the Nature Day in COP26? Yeah, over to you.
Thanks, Kat. Yeah, so nature is a pretty broad term. I mean, when we talk about it scientifically, we're talking about the physical world and everything in it. So that's the animals, the plants, the mountains, the oceans. And then within that, all of sort of these features and processes that happen or exist independently of us, of people. But then when we're talking about nature at COP specifically, this is focusing on topics around agriculture, land use change, and forests. But then it's also about recognising that nature is really at the forefront of climate change. As Alex Sharma has stated, the natural world is humanity's first line of defence against the climate crisis. And I think what's been nice about this COP is we've never had this much attention sort of on negotiations around nature and biodiversity. And that's been really great to see. So hopefully that will be sort of a pivot point in sort of us becoming harmonious with the natural world and being able to move forward as one crisis rather than 2.
Yeah, brilliant. I think that leads very, very nicely onto your first point, your first takeaway from the Nature Day at COP26. And that was really the recognition, you say, of climate change and biodiversity as intertwined crises. Is there anything else you'd like to elaborate on that a bit? Is that sort of, are they intertwined? Yeah. Of course, they're kind of inherently intertwined, but also, I guess, in sort of like, yeah, no, you go ahead, talk about that intertwining.
So yeah, to the point where they were considered as 2 separate crises, like they've had their own COPs. And I think our COP on climate change is probably the one that we're most familiar with. But I reckon what a lot of people didn't know is that, a few weeks prior to this, there was COP15 on the Convention of Biological Diversity. And that had been delayed, like with most things throughout this pandemic, and they actually split that conference in half. So there were some initial discussions just a few weeks before this COP on climate change, and then they'll sort of restart those conversations again spring next year. And other than sort of the obvious that delaying any sort of response to climate change, inevitably can make things worse, and we're sort of missing our chances. But in this case, I think it could benefit nature and biodiversity, because there's been a lot of momentum built up around this. I think people are really starting to see sort of how intertwined these two crises really are. And, inaction in one area is going to harm the other. But likewise, any solutions will be mutually beneficial. So hopefully, when they restart the negotiations at COP15 around nature and biodiversity, when they're starting to make those pledges, hopefully we'll see some really big commitments there, in addition to what we've already seen this week.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, how when we refer to COP and COP26, in my mind, instinctively often runs to the climate change COP, but COP obviously just means the conference of parties, and so COP15 it's just a conference of the countries signed up to the UNFCCC. But it is, I think, quite stark how little coverage COP15 I should say, on biodiversity got. I think that was in China a few weeks ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. And I think part of the reason now why we're sort of only just getting to this point where nature is becoming part of the big conversation is we're also reaching a point now where businesses and governments are realizing how much of our economies actually rely on nature. Yes, they're also a massive part of the solution, but over half of our world's GDP is at moderate or high risk due to nature loss, and that's huge. And I think when you start bringing money into the conversation, unfortunately, people start to listen.
It's well evident throughout governments' negotiations the importance of economic considerations when it comes to prioritizing climate change and biodiversity loss. But I mean, at least some, as you said, at least some kind of optimism in the fact that there is momentum there. For whatever reasons, it's better that there is momentum than none at all, I suppose. So now I feel we've given a bit of hopefully a kind of broad context to our audience. And I would also just like to say quickly to the audience that if throughout you have any questions, or if you feel we're missing out something, or you'd like anything going over again, then obviously this is being live streamed live. So do just drop that into our socials channels, and we'll try and cover those towards the end if you do have any questions. But now we do hopefully have a good context, and hopefully there aren't any gaping holes that I have left at this stage. Emily, I was wondering if you could talk about the second bullet point on this slide, the second thing you'd like to highlight from the Day of Negotiations on Nature, which was that landmark forests declaration. Or was that from the Day on Nature, or was that... I think
this has sort of been ongoing in the sort of the number of countries that have been signing up. But I think it was on Nature Day we hit sort of 91%.
Brilliant. Okay.
So this declaration is like hundreds of nations are pledging to end deforestation. And so they're committing to halt deforestation and land degradation by 2030. And we're seeing some of the really sort of big players in this topic. So this is including Brazil, China, Russia, and Indonesia, which is able to reach this sort of, covering 91% of forests globally. And this is huge. And this has also include financial pledges from governments and private sectors. And what's nice about this is these funds are going to prioritize developing countries, which is great. Why is this so important in protecting our forests? And that's because forests is one of our strongest natural barriers to climate change through their sort of removal and storage of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But then we also have, when we're through deforestation practices, which typically is through burning of trees and chopping them down. This then also releases significant amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere. So it's like a double effect in this sense. And I think another nice point about sort of this declaration is also committing funds specifically to protecting the rights and livelihoods of Indigenous communities, which is really nice to see. And I think it's a little bit different to perhaps previous COPs and conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's heartening to see reference to Indigenous rights and Indigenous peoples. And as we talked about in our live discussion on Saturday, it's clear that those commitments are still insufficient, and those Indigenous peoples' voices are still not being heard to the extent they need to be. But again, that is a first step to at least recognise, forest tenure rights for Indigenous communities. And additionally, it's interesting to hear about a different target for 2030, since we're so accustomed to hearing about net zero, the achievement of 1.5, goals of 2070, 2050, 2030. But with the tipping points we know facing several forests and much of nature at the moment, at least there is some commitment to ending deforestation, albeit in 10 years' time. So we've talked a bit about deforestation there and that landmark forest declaration. I wondered if you could talk a bit more about the agricultural policy. You said about many nations signing up to that forest declaration, but it's 45 specifically agreeing on this agricultural policy reform.
Yeah, I think the agricultural food system is sort of where we're sort of still lagging behind, and perhaps it's been a little bit more of a disappointing outcome. Cool. It's such a huge contributor to the climate crisis. Sort of, I think it's around 1/4 of annual greenhouse gas emissions are coming from our land use, and that's predominantly through agriculture and raising livestock. And then our land use for agriculture is also responsible for 3/4 of deforestation. So it's huge, but it's not really, our whole sort of food system has not been really at the forefront of conversation. Yes, we've spoken about agricultural and more sustainable farming systems and sort of the land use surrounding that, but we haven't really considered the food system as a whole. So sort of all our supply chains, how are we getting that food from A to B? So I think that's been a slight disappointment. I think this particular policy, sort of known as FACT, so that's the Forest and Agricultural Commodity Trade. And this policy is designed to help policymakers take action to deliver low carbon and deforestation-free food systems, and also designed to help reduce food waste, which is a massive issue, and then also support workers. I think it's still very much a work in progress, and there's a lot of details perhaps missing, specific details, and the specifics of how we're going to reach there. So again, it's a step in the right direction, but I think when we talk about agriculture and the food system, perhaps there hasn't been as positive advancements as we've seen for sort of forests and other areas of nature, which is a shame.
Definitely, and it's I don't know, it's quite telling. I always think this when we talk about the Nature Day, and indeed we referenced it at the start, how it feels that too much is bundled into the Nature Day at COP26 to talk on the same presentation slide and in the same breath about biodiversity. Of course, biodiversity, deforestation, the food supply are linked, but so is every issue at COP26 with one another. And I think it's interesting to talk about how significant and indeed unresolved, as you say, Emily, these issues on the food supply are. And yet it's sort of getting, an afternoon of negotiations, perhaps on the Day of Nature, in which there is so much else to talk about. You mentioned as well about making sure those commitments are kept to, which touches upon kind of the issue of transparency, which runs again through the whole of COP26. How do we make sure these broad imagined commitments are actually achieved? And indeed, that's something I'm looking forward to talking about a bit with Oceans as well. But more broadly, how do kind of the issues we've talked about with nature intersect with other themes at COP26? So transparency, perhaps, adaptation, perhaps. We've, of course, talked about Indigenous peoples as well.
Yeah. So I think nature is very closely linked with adaptation, loss, and damage. So this is all about delivering practical solutions that are needed to adapt to climate impacts and to address the loss and damage that's already happened. So a lot of these include nature-based solutions. So what we mean by that is solutions that sort of combat the climate crisis by protecting our habitats, expanding our natural carbon sinks, so ecosystems like our forests, peat bogs, wetlands, and then this is also about preventing wildlife loss. And through this, we can really sort of create some resilience against climate impacts such as sea level rise. Some mangrove roots can help protect our coastlines. We can improve our air quality, resistance to flooding, resistance to fire. So it's really all about utilising nature to work for us rather than against us. But then so we have all these sort of positive ways in which these nature-based solutions can help us, but then only 3% of global climate finance was spent on nature, so that was sort of the statistics pre-COP, and then only 1% for adaptation. So we're also very heavily reliant on all the finance discussions that have been going on, so we can really implement these solutions to make a positive difference. And so far there has been a lot of money pledged, but then again, it's all about just seeing that through.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's a role for both the private sector to take on a greater role in delivering nature-based solutions, and also, as you say quite rightly, clearly the public sector to start giving enough money for nature-based solutions to become a really, as indeed they are, a really viable and major part in our kind of armory against climate, like extreme weather events and climate change. So I think from the sounds of our discussion more broadly, it sounds like there are still quite a lot of kind of open issues in nature, that there has been some steps forward, but there are quite a lot of doors yet that have been opened and not shut in sort of in terms of negotiations, obviously particularly talking about food there. Yeah. So what sort of things are you expecting, looking to, again, like I guess the latter part of COP15, which will happen in Aprilish times? This doesn't need to necessarily be specific, but just for kind of our viewers more generally, what sort of things should they be keeping an eye out for that need to be talked about still? What's still unresolved?
I mean, I think having sort of this delayed COP15 almost puts us in like a unique situation, because it gives sort of leaders and sort of all our policy leaders, governments, the private sector to really respond to the feedback we have got from this week. Like, what do we still, what is the public saying is still unresolved? So there is a lot of backlash around, say, the food system. And now is a really chance to sort of respond on that and keep on all the motivation that's going. So it's all around the food system. And then if we're thinking about sort of who has been sort of key in the conversation so far, I think it's been really great when we talk about deforestation and forests, and a lot of the key players have been there. But then we should be asking ourselves who should be the key contributors to these conversations. And I know we have touched upon this, and that is Indigenous communities. Like, they are the experts and the examples of how to live in harmony with nature, and within their territories. They currently contain 80% of the world's biodiversity. Wow. That's huge. And, they've been involved in sort of side events, perhaps, and discussions, but they haven't been really involved in the negotiations. And I think we've really missed a chance there. And hopefully in a COP that is about biodiversity, hopefully Indigenous people will then be involved in the negotiations and will have a front seat.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one would hope, being a few months further into the sort of, as it were, sort of delivery of vaccines and such forth, and general relaxing of international regulations on travel, that should also facilitate that. But as you say, it's not just about getting Indigenous peoples to events, it's about ensuring they're at the heart of those negotiations. And as we were talking about, as I said last Saturday, that's something that's been so starkly absent from COP26, is that access to decision making and ability to influence decision making for Indigenous communities. So that's really useful, Emily. Thank you for that kind of reminder of what we need to be looking out for going forward. So I think then my last question on nature is a bit of a kind of broader one. I mean, it can be as broad or specific as you'd like, really, but what issues are overlooked in nature, whether that's like discussions on the Nature Day in COP26, or just when we talk about nature and the climate crisis? What are we missing out? We must be missing out some things.
So I think one particular area that we perhaps overlook and doesn't get the attention it deserves is the role of wetlands. We talk massively about forests being a carbon sink, but wetlands actually hold some of the largest carbon stores on the planet. And I don't think a lot of people know that. And they've been sort of already massively disturbed through our like agricultural practices and land practices. And when that happens, when they're disturbed or drained, they then release massive amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So that includes carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And we don't really talk about that much about them, about their capabilities to be used as a nature-based solution. So I think that's a shame. And I think more people should be aware that it's not just about the forests. Yes, that is a massive contributor, but we also have other ecosystems that can massively help us and that deserve to be like restored.
Yeah, absolutely. No, again, one of those sort of interesting things about the COP26 narrative, and indeed climate change narrative more generally, is, I mean, I'm certainly guilty of this as well. You know, my eyes are so centrally on deforestation as a sort of like in terms of biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapses, but there are so many other crucially important ecosystems that we maybe aren't talking about as much, and we really, really need to be, because it's what's almost as important for us as kind of like climate activists and members of civil society is making sure that those crucial aspects of the climate crisis are part of our conversations and a part of the conversation surrounding COP26 and the climate crisis. So thank you so much, Emily. That was hugely enlightening. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
Anything else you'd like to add before we move on to the ocean? Anything else that I've missed out or you'd like to highlight?
No, I think we've touched on all the points really. That was really great. Thank you.
Yeah, no, of course, it was my pleasure. So Vince, our time to now move on to oceans. So I think, again, as I kind of did just now when we were talking about nature, I think initially a kind of contextual point to sort of ground our viewers and make sure we're all sort of in the same place, because not everyone, I think, will automatically associate oceans with climate change in the atmosphere. You know, I think we often sort of compartmentalize parts of the climate crisis. So why are these areas of the environment so inseparable?
So overall, as it stands, there is, as Emily said, we are intertwined as far as nature and us. And if you want to go as far as the economy and everything like that, everything's intertwined. We can't necessarily have a planet that is doing well if our nature is doing poorly, because we rest solely on, realistically, how our nature and how our ecosystems are developing health-wise. So being able to recognize the fact that both, whether it be nature on land or nature in the oceans, also reflect issues that will be affecting us, such as climate change, and then further down the line, if we want to talk about economics or social issues, I think it is a good place to realize that nature has that importance there. So especially with oceans, they take up quite a percentage of the world, and they are responsible for the economies of quite a few vulnerable and developing nations, which in the face of climate change have had quite a hard time, one, being able to maintain their infrastructure or build capacity and mitigate against the impacts of climate change, and then have to deal with the issues that are happening within our oceans. So we're talking about ocean acidification, we're talking about sea level rise, we're talking about fisheries collapse and things like this. So it is quite important for these topics to be brought up, especially when it comes to protecting oceans. But it is something that I think gets overlooked quite a bit when you're talking about climate change, is sometimes not looking at the links that it has to our oceans, our forests, our peatlands, or anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, when we were talking about nature just now, of course, nature or biodiversity at the very least, did have its own conference of parties, its own COP15 a few weeks ago, which was, I think, just for clarity's sake, I'll just mention it, it's sort of been cut in two. So it had a sort of, I believe, like an online version a few weeks ago. And then in April 2022, it's going to have a sort of, I believe, an in-person version. Is there an ocean COP? Is there, and does that exist?
There is a UN conference that is at the end of June, beginning of July, so it runs over 4 days. And so this year it's going to be held in Lisbon in Portugal. And so it remains to be seen what is going to be discussed there, but I think that happening after COP, we might be seeing a lot of things that have been discussed or pledged at COP now might not only come to fruition until then. So maybe that's when they're going to be discussing what exactly is in the fine print, because we have seen a few pledges and commitments come from this COP26 in regards to oceans, not a huge amount. So I would hope that they haven't forgotten it. But the Nature Day has been quite important. And I think, as you said, it is a bit difficult to combine so many different things into one day. But I think oceans overall are still something that are a bit underrepresented and that we need to talk about a bit more.
Definitely, yeah. And I always think it's astonishing that, of course, I'm sure COP26 can't be 365 days a year, but nonetheless, I always find it astonishing that they try and cram it all into 2 weeks because there's so much to talk about. So it's, again, I mean, of course, better than having no conference on oceans at all, but it's interesting that it's only 4 days long and we haven't had a dedicated day to oceans at COP26. These are global issues which require a lot of discussion, and those are quite tight timelines to talk about things. But yeah, I mean, focusing on COP26 then, we can deal with the UN Summit on Oceans when we actually get there. I was wondering if you could explain what your first point was taking away from oceans at COP26 so far. So the 30 by 30, what that is and how you feel about that, yeah.
So the 30 by 30 goal as it stands is to protect or ensure that 30% of the world's oceans are protected by 2030. So for comparison's sake, at the moment, we're roughly at 8%. So that is quite an ask. And I think it will be quite interesting to see how these things develop. So prior to COP26, actually, there were a few MPAs to marine protected areas that had been announced as being larger, especially for coastline countries or big ocean states, where they were trying to protect as much of their areas as they can. So getting to a 30% goal is very important and it's very interesting, but I'd like to see a bit more about how exactly they plan on getting there, because a lot of the pledges surround, yes, we're going to get there, we want to protect it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be enforced either.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a sort of perennial problem with ocean, as with many other parts of the climate crisis, is that transparency issue. But the ocean is, of course, enormous and does not belong to anyone in particular. So those issues of transparency and ensuring those conservation areas are protected is ever more difficult. Is there anything else you would like to say about that issue of transparency at all? Or
Oh, absolutely. I think the thing that gets forgotten a lot is oceans, yeah, as you said, they're not necessarily owned by one person or groups of countries or whatnot, but they still do have an exclusive economic zone. So up to a certain amount past a shoreline, all that ocean belongs to a country. So a lot of small island developing states, or as we're referring to them now as big ocean states, because realistically they have a much larger water footprint, so to speak, than they do a land mass. They have quite a vast marine resource, but they don't have the capacity to patrol or to monitor those areas. So they can declare an area to be a marine protected area, and that can contribute to a 30 by 30 goal. But arguably, we need to then know, like, are these areas actually protected? Because being protected is also different from a fishing moratorium, say. So it's all in the language as well, is we need to try and figure out what is being protected, how it's being protected, if it's being monitored, and who by.
Yeah.
And so we often forget when we're saying things like this, like, oh, it's great to hear that, for example, let's say Tuvalu or the Marshall Islands have increased their marine protected areas, but it makes for a good headline, and I'm sure that they have the best intentions in mind, but they also realize that they don't have the means to protect it and through patrolling or anything like this. I think one of the major issues that we don't realize is poaching is a massive issue in marine environments, and it's worth several $1 billion a year in terms of marine poaching. And it's not something that countries are necessarily interested in going after, because it costs a lot of money to look for poaching vessels when you know how big the ocean is.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I didn't know at all about that. That economic zone sort of ownership of certain parts of the ocean around past a coastline. Because indeed, you're right. Small island developing states are actually quite big if you take into account the sheer amount of ocean which they therefore have as part of their territory. But indeed, yeah, that issue of transparency, as I say, such a kind of continual issue with COP26 and climate change generally, but I feel is especially, and from what you say, it sounds is especially pronounced with the ocean, because to declare something a marine protected area, if you do not have the huge amount of resources needed to ensure it is protected, becomes a slightly less meaningful label. Do you think that's fair to say?
No, absolutely. And I also don't want that to be disparaging in any ways to big ocean states either, because it's, I think they also realize that having these resources and this amount, they need to protect it. But again, it comes down to, as Emily was saying, it comes down to finance as well. At the end of the day, is you need to be able to put money, or you need to put capital behind whatever action that you're putting through, whether it is economic or whether it is nature. At the end of the day, finance is still something that you need to provide. And so for these countries, they need to have the capacity to, one, adapt, be resilient, combat climate change, develop their economies, and then protect these water resources. So it's a big ask. Yeah,
absolutely. No, thank you for that. And I think indeed that leads very smoothly onto your second bullet point, actually, which was not planned, but that has worked wonderfully well. The creation of blue bonds to help fund sustainable ocean practices. So blue bonds, was that a thing that existed before COP26? Is that a new kind of idea, particularly funded at COP26? And how is that developed?
So it's not necessarily a new idea, but I think it's the first time that they've actually implemented it to this scale. So the idea of a blue bond is essentially, there was two that were issued. There's one for, I'm going to say Chile in South America, and the other one being in Fiji. And the idea being that both of those countries are going to be receiving a set amount of money to go towards sustainable development practices and how they relate directly to the ocean. So that can be building new conservation areas, that can be monitoring, that can be, as long as it's promoting either also indigenous communities and their efforts and their programs, as well as local programs from NGOs or others. It's just money that is supposed to be going from an organization or a developed nation to another one to try and figure out how to best fund programs in that area. So in that regard, it's a lot like the REDD+ program for trees. So where countries like Norway, for example, have a massive fund, and they use that fund to help conserve forests, let that be in Indonesia or in Brazil, based off of how much forests either of those countries have helped protect or how much forest they've managed to grow back. So it's kind of an incentive-based way of encouraging conservation. It has its own problems associated with it, but at the end of the day, it is a good way of being able to provide capital and financing for sustainable development programs in these specific areas.
Yeah, absolutely. So has that funding come through noticeably at COP26 then? Has there been a sort of a greater momentum for those blue bonds and that financing, or is that still a bit of a gap?
I think it's still a bit of a gap. I think there's only two countries at the moment who have, I think, announced that they've been able to secure blue bonds. I think they were the two first countries ever. So listen, you have to start somewhere. So I want to hope that maybe between now and the next Oceans conference that we might have more. And I think it might also be a bit of proof of concept, if it works in Fiji, say, then that can be a blueprint that can be adapted elsewhere. Yeah. So I think it's just one step towards it. But I think blue bonds can definitely help, and I think we should be on the lookout for more of that, or if not, more developments regarding a blue economy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one step towards it, but we need the further steps to be taken quickly after that.
Yeah.
No time to waste on it. That's really interesting. Though. Thank you very much. And I mean, I guess more generally then, your last point was the under recognition of oceans at COP. I know I saw some, indeed in ClimaTalk's, one of ClimaTalk's most recent articles, issues about delegates from small island developing states or big ocean states, am I right? Is big ocean states? Not being able to access COP26 because of like vaccine restrictions and travel restrictions in their own countries due to sort of recognition of vaccines, sheer access to vaccines. And that's obviously just one set of representatives of the oceans because they are so directly impacted by it. Could you elaborate a bit on that and about that kind of general under recognition of oceans and under representation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was one of the major issues that was coming from developing nations, especially small island states or big ocean states, was that going into COP26, a lot of them either couldn't have access to Glasgow, so for the reasons you mentioned, and also from a finance standpoint, it's quite expensive to get a delegation from point A to point B. And especially trying to find accommodation, trying to find your transport for everything like that. In times of COVID, even more so. So I think there was definitely a bit of an outcry on that hand. I think it was a third of Pacific Islands, for example, haven't been able to send a delegation. So that's quite a lot when you think about it. And considering that these other countries are also on the front lines of climate change. And then the other issue with financing, obviously, was we discussed it very briefly. Well, in depth last week, but I'll go over it very briefly. Those countries also didn't get the $100 billion per year that they've been promised for sustainability and resilience programs. So yeah, there is definitely an idea, I think, amongst big ocean states that they are not necessarily being heard. Whether or not that's true, I think personally that it is. I think that it is very easy to put aside those countries when it comes to global discussions, especially if they're happening in the global north, especially if you don't have them in the room. I think it's a bit easier to also not discuss the issues. But also, as I was saying before, the ocean is massive. And the amount of money and investment that needs to go towards protecting the ocean is not inconsequential. So it's a conversation that I think a lot of countries also don't want to have because they know that the amount of money that would be needed is far exceeding the 100 billion a year that they've already pledged but can't contribute, and things like that. I think it's going a bit too deep into their pockets, unfortunately. And unfortunately for small island states or big ocean states, they're footing the bill forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also wanted to say just quickly for clarity's sake from our audience about you quite rightly mentioning the sheer expense of coming to Glasgow if you're from, particularly a Pacific state. I think that's the starkest example of sort of sheer distance, other side of the world, about how it's, when we talk about delegations going to COP, of course, the most important delegations are likely to be the government of those countries. And it's astonishing that a third of those countries haven't even been able to have a government delegation. But at COP26, there's been a huge amount of civil society activists, NGOs, often from global north organizations. And it's excellent to have that, that NGO and civil society voice. But the expense of accessing COP26, if you're an NGO or you're a civil society group from a global south country, or particularly from an island state, that's going to be a prohibitive expense, isn't it? So just, I thought for clarity's sake, I would emphasize the fact, when we talk about delegations, we're not just talking about prime ministers and presidents, we're talking also about the representatives who are often on the ground in those countries not being able to come to COP. And I think that's what's so hard to sort of talk about the developments at COP, knowing that there are these huge voices in the room absent. I had a sort of a slightly broader point as well, just to ask, which I think we've pretty much covered. So feel free to tell me if you think we've pretty much gone over this already. But we've emphasised a lot how the ocean is really big, and how big island states are probably the best representatives to talk about the ocean because they're on the front line of the climate crisis. They live alongside the ocean in a way that you can't understand if we don't, and we can't have that kind of accurate voice about living with the ocean if you live in the middle of a continent. But is that the route to giving the ocean a voice at COP? The ocean is obviously enormous, and my point is you can't have a delegation for the ocean, or can you? Like, how can we look to have more of a voice and give more of a voice to the ocean in future negotiations and COPs?
That's a very good question.
I know.
There actually is an alliance called the Alliance of Small Island States, so AOSIS, and they represent islands as a whole. And every so often they change the chair, so it's a different island that is essentially sending a representative as a chairman for the Alliance of Small Island States, and so they are at COP. And so during the first week of COP, they were meeting and trying to figure out what their agenda was and how they would be able to, and what exactly they were trying to get from COP26 as a whole, to try and push through their agenda as well in terms of what they wanted to see done. So on one hand, that's very good that we're getting groups like AOSIS that are coming in and being able to give a voice to those who are not able to be in Glasgow over these 2 weeks. Obviously, it'd be even better if it was AOSIS plus all of the countries as well. But I think and I hope that oceans and big ocean states are also going to start being heard more. I think Emily touched on it as well a bit before, but at the end of the day, people are starting to realize that nature, or the oceans as well, are having an impact on the economy. And usually that's when things start shifting, is when people start realizing that the resources that they're using are going to be impacted. And on that note, I think the ocean is very, very important for a lot of economies, and whether they're small or large, at some point they are using the ocean. And I think that that's hopefully going to come through, maybe by the end of this COP, maybe before the next ocean COP in June, July, but we'll see. I think there are reasons to be positive, cautiously, but I think we should be good in the long run, hopefully.
Wonderful. Yeah, no, that's thank you very much for that as well. Again, something I didn't know at all about that alliance, and important to get, again, as ever, to give those countries voices at these negotiations. So before we close up then, because I think we have pretty much reached the end of our live discussion time, I just wanted to ask if you think there's anything I've missed out. Is there anything else you'd like to highlight before we head off? No? Wonderful. Yeah, no, that's great then. All that leaves is for me to say thank you so much, Emily and Vince, for joining me. It's been hugely interesting to talk to you both, and a real pleasure to learn from you both about nature and the ocean. So thank you very much as well to our audience for joining us and for following along. And remember that we will be, for the rest of this week until Friday, holding live discussions just like this on the issues covered the day prior at COP. So tomorrow we're going to be talking about adaptation and transparency, because today is our adaptation discussion day at COP26. So if you'd like to keep up to date with COP26, those issues which were being discussed, and the disappointments, but also those reasons for optimism that we're seeing, albeit cautious optimism, then certainly please do join us over the rest of the next week, every day at midday, for more discussions like this with our wonderful trackers and speakers. So thank you very much again to Emily and Vincent, and thank you also for joining us. I'll see you tomorrow.